Hello, and welcome to our Wednesday Bible class from the Eubank Church of Christ. We've been studying from the book of Proverbs using Mike Willis's workbook on that particular topic. Mike went through and grouped many of the various passages from Proverbs along certain thematic lines throughout the book. And so today we're going to be looking at a lesson that is very, very timely for the day and time in which we live. It's lesson 9 in our workbook. He entitles it The Disciplined Spirit. But what he basically is talking about throughout the whole course of the lesson is dealing with our management of anger. Anger is a big problem in our society right now. Many people are angry over a lot of different things, and we see a lot of acting out that goes with that anger as the anger is uncontrolled. And as we look at the verses in this lesson today, we're going to understand there is a notable difference between controlled anger and uncontrolled anger. God gave us anger as a human emotion. It can have a positive benefit. If you've ever watched a coach, for example, he understands the motivating aspect of anger. Sometimes he'll be very rough on his players, saying things to them that seem almost abusive, but he's able to get them riled up. That gets the adrenaline flowing, and often they're going to show him, and they go out onto the football field or back out to the basketball court with an intensified zeal to work even harder at the sport. And it can have a good outcome whenever the anger is channeled and controlled. But unfortunately, for most people, as we will notice in the lesson today, anger is an uncontrolled emotion, and it causes them to do a lot of unseemly things. In question 1 in this lesson, he says, what kinds of foolish things does a person do when he is angry? And whenever we look at a few of the passages that he has listed over in Proverbs 14 and verse 17, we begin to understand some of the things that kind of come to the forefront whenever somebody is dealing with their anger. In Proverbs 14, going down to verse 17, he that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. Going down to verse 29 of this same chapter, he says, he that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Over in the 29th chapter of Proverbs, and going down to verse 20, he also says, seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? There is more hope of a fool than of him. Over and over again, Solomon begins to deal with what happens when we kind of fly by the seat of our pants, so to speak, or our anger is just very quick and uncontrolled and flashes and flares up. Over in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and going down to verse 9, he says, be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger is restful in the bosom of fools. So whenever we actually look at the question, what are some of the kinds of foolish things that a person does whenever they are angry? Well, I thought of a few that I've observed down through the years. Someone can act hastily without thinking of the consequences. They will say and do things that they would not normally do if they were of a clear mind. We find that in Proverbs 14 and verse 17, it says that he acts foolishly. Well, I've seen people get angry and kick a car tire, or be angry and try to punch a hole in the wall, things that oftentimes are detrimental and even hurt them because they just were not thinking. And then, of course, there are all of those inappropriate things that often come out of their mouth whenever an individual is suffering with his uncontrolled anger. In question 2, it says, what kinds of sins are committed when anger is uncontrolled? Now, this is where we begin to see the problem in what we're talking about with anger. It pushes us into sinful actions. In Proverbs 29 and going down to verse 22, we find that Solomon talks about this. An angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgression. If somebody is looking for a fight, it doesn't take much to get him started. And in order to get the fight provoked, he may say and do all kinds of things, from bullying to saying hurtful things and demeaning things to others, to misbehave in a lot of ways, because he is wanting this anger to escalate. He's wanting things to get worse and worse and worse. So uncontrolled anger is going to bring out the worst in somebody. Often individuals have learned that if you want to defeat someone else, just get them angry, because then they're going to not think properly. They're going to make foolish mistakes, and they can be much more easily defeated. In James chapter 1 and going down to verse 20, James says, "For the wrath of a man worketh not the righteousness of God." Here's the sobering point for Christians. Whenever we get involved in our temper getting the better of us, then we wind up doing things of which we will probably need to repent, because sin is going to follow in those footsteps. In Ephesians chapter 4 and going to verse 26, Paul says, "Be ye angry." That may happen from time to time. "Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." We have got to think about all of the things that anger and wrath can trigger us to do. Earlier in this lesson, on the very first page, Mike lists several of these things: cursing, fighting, revenge, abusive speech, murder, manifestations of hatred, slander, character assassination, all kinds of loud clamor, and even false witnessing, making false accusations of one sort or another. All of these are the fruits that come back when an individual is caught up in his anger and wrath. That's why Paul says here in Ephesians chapter 4 that that's something that we need to get over pretty fast. Don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, but rather, whenever those moments of anger arise, find quick ways to diffuse that. Learn how to manage your anger so that you will be able to avoid sinful behaviors. Because anger like this, in question 2, is going to stir up strife, and it's going to cause sins in many different ways. As James tells us, it's going to cause us to work acts of unrighteousness. And so we don't want to commit the sins that can go along with that. In question 3, he says, why is anger used to excuse conduct that is sinful? Sometimes that becomes the go-to for many people. "Oh, I just have a temper." As if everyone's supposed to get used to that. "I just get angry easily." As if that should be an excuse for the misbehaviors that follow. Angry actions can be transferred toward the innocent whenever we get all carried away like this. So we behave in a way when we are not thinking. We begin to make other excuses. "Well, I just got carried away. I just wasn't thinking. I just lost control." As if those excuses are going to suddenly make all of the hurt go away that we've caused. The pain of the hateful things that we said, maybe even the injuries that we caused to somebody else because we were angry. So many cases of domestic abuse and physical and sexual abuse are reported in our country every year, of individuals who lose their temper and then are abusive to somebody else, and then say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I guess I got carried away," as if that's supposed to make it all better. Anger has got to be controlled. Anger has got to be managed. And if we cannot master that skill, then we are in for a long, rough life of abuse and punishment ourselves. In question 4, he says, how does anger stir up strife? That's the point that Solomon makes over in Proverbs chapter 10 and going down to verse 12. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. The individual who is seething with hatred is looking to pick a fight and to let his anger flare. Over in Proverbs 15 and going down to verse 18, a wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife. Being angry and thus misbehaving is a place that we just don't want to go to. And we should work very, very diligently to learn how to control those angry outbursts. Back over there where we were in Proverbs 29 and going down to verse 22, an angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgressions. The angry actions that we manifest whenever we are out of control often get transferred to the innocent. And so we wind up being angry at somebody at work, let's say. And so we come home and we take it out on the dog. Then we maybe are mean to the children, and we can be abusive toward the wife and toward others that did nothing to us. But we're dealing with anger, and we've not yet gotten it under control and gotten it out of our system. So we take it out on the innocent. There in Proverbs 15 and going down to verse 18, the wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth strife. We don't want to go venting our anger on the innocent and doing things that should not be done. We've got to understand the importance of disciplining our spirit, remaining in control, and learning how to watch and constantly police our mouth and our actions, anger notwithstanding. In question 5, he says, in what way is anger outrageous or like a flood, as the New American Standard Version reads over in Proverbs chapter 27 and going down to verse 4. The Old King James Version says, wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? In the English Standard Version, it talks about what happens here. He says, wrath is cruel and anger is overwhelming. I like that. And when it's overwhelming, it's the anger takes control and it drives us to extreme behaviors. It overwhelms everything in its path. So many times individuals will become so angry that they either assault somebody else and wind up in jail for it, or in extreme cases, they may even become so angry that they take somebody else's life. All of these come from this uncontrolled anger, and there's no place for it, and there's no excuse for it. God's word is telling us to deal with the anger and get it out of our system. Now, one of the contributing factors that stirs up our anger is sometimes related to our pride. Over in Proverbs chapter 21 and going down to verse 24, proud and haughty scorner is his name, who dealeth in proud wrath. We can have anger that arises within us because our pride gets hurt. We've become embarrassed. We feel that maybe our status as leader and the one that should be looked up to, we feel our status is threatened. And so we want to be able to squelch any embarrassment and any opposition, and our anger flares up. Someone's going to call us chicken if we don't respond with violence. We're going to be teased and we are going to be pushed and scorned. Often, if we cannot keep control, we wind up giving in to anger and trying to fight back, and we usually play right into the hands of the agitator. It's not going to work out to our benefit. So we've got to control our pride, so we cannot have that used against us, a way in which someone attacks this pride of life that we hold on to so dear, that moves us on into sinful actions. In question 7, he said, how is an angry individual like a city without walls? In Proverbs chapter 25 and going down to verse 28, he makes that point. He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. An angry person makes poor decisions. An angry person puts himself in leave of his absence of his senses, so to speak, and is more easily subdued and defeated because he can't control and think about what's the proper response. And in so doing, he brings himself to great calamity. He's just like the defenseless city that doesn't have any walls, has no way of protecting itself, because anger is not a protective device. It tends to make us even more susceptible to losing and falling victim to somebody who is thinking about what he's doing. So the question kind of boils down to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 20, when the author asks, when is anger sinful? In Galatians chapter 5, it talks about anger being a work of the flesh. And what happens here is that our uncontrolled anger shows our carnality. It shows how that we're more worried about our social status here, what people think of us here, how we are regarded by others, than how God looks at us and our behavior. In Ephesians chapter 4, going to verse 31, Paul says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Everything that's in this category, anger, clamor, wrath, malice, evil speaking, all of those things are characteristics that the Christian wants to get out of his life. We want to be able to get all of those strifeful things, all of those areas of irritation and anger. We want to get those worked out of our character and behavior as children of God. We want to be patient toward all men. We want to have the love that Christ had even for his tormentors. But whenever we fail in that and revert back to the way of the world, we're behaving as those who know not God. We're behaving as those who are just carnally minded, worried about the here and now. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and going to verse 3, Paul says, for ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men? That's the stuff that the world does. And having that hot, uncontrolled anger is like a flash fire. It flashes for a moment, and then it burns itself out, and it's over. But as we mentioned a moment ago, others do not forget. The victims of our anger are scarred by the things that we do, either physically or emotionally. And so we have to understand the improper thing that we're doing, because this is opening the door to every kind of evil work. We're no longer regarding ourselves as controlled, godly, and on the path to heaven. It's all about me, what I want, I'm angry, and things need to be fixed, and I'm going to fix them. James says in James chapter 3, and going down to verse 16, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. So getting a handle on that anger is critically important. Now he gives us some words to define here in question number 9, and these are words that come from that passage we were looking at in Ephesians chapter 4, because there he used several different references to this idea of anger and the manifestations of it. He talked about wrath and anger and clamor. Well, what are those? Well, wrath is just the extreme anger. Someone becomes blinded by their anger, and they cannot think straight nor see straight, as they simply want to strike out to whatever it is they are angry at. But anger, defined in the dictionary, is a strong feeling of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility. We're angry, we're grumbling about it, we're having hard feelings about it, we're feeling hostile towards someone or something, and so anger has filled our hearts. And then clamor is just the noise that we make. There are some people, when they get angry, they get louder and louder and louder. Have you ever watched what happens in an argument? The angrier the people get, the louder their voices go. But here he talks about clamor, and it's a loud shouting, and it's the reflecting of confusion. synonyms for it, or an uproar or a tumult. And that's what happens as we become angry. Our vocal range increases. We get louder and louder as we scream and yell to vent the anger that we're feeling, oftentimes toward somebody else. In question 10, he says, what qualifications of an elder prohibit a man of uncontrolled anger from being appointed? And the qualifications for an elder in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. In those qualifications, let's just look at some of them that show us that an angry-natured man, someone with a quick temper, is not to be in the position of being an elder. As Timothy talks about those qualifications, as Paul is writing to him about them, a person who is to be an elder is to be of good behavior. He's no striker, and he's not a brawler. He is not given to wanting to settle things with his fist and getting into arguments. He is of good behavior. When Paul was writing to Titus about the qualifications for an elder, he said it should be a man who is not accused of riot or unruly. He goes on to say he's not soon angry. He is no striker. He is very temperate. He's in control. He's able to maintain his cool even in stressful circumstances and situations. And so those are the qualities that godly men want to nurture and develop, not blind rage. We find in question 11, he says, name some temporal consequences of uncontrolled anger. Well, with uncontrolled anger, you see sometimes people destroying property, banging around on things and destroying them because they are mad. You will see fights erupt, assault takes place because someone has lost their temper. Even in the extreme, we see actions of murder. Now, at this point, individuals sometimes say, well, the Bible talks about God being angry, so it can't be all bad. Well, let's just for a moment compare some characteristics of God's anger with the characteristics of man's uncontrolled anger. When God is angry, it's control and it's with a purpose. He gets angry at sin and he's going to do something about that. It's not with hatred and malice and resentment. God's greater than all of that, and those things are not going to be characteristic of him. His anger is not for selfish ends. It's for what's the best in the situation. His anger is an expression of concern. It's a righteous indignation, if you will. It is to correct or to curtail destructive behavior. It's an expression of God's care. It's not to just break relationships. It's not an injustice. It's not an anger. It's willful. It is not, he has an anger toward willful disobedience. Those are some of the things that we see God's anger being channeled toward as he gives us that example. But man's anger, on the other hand, is uncontrolled. It's not going to accomplish anything. There's no purpose there. It is accompanied by hatred and malice and resentment as we want to get even or to hurt somebody else. Because we're selfish. It's all about us and what we think is right or wrong. It's an expression of indignation. We have been insulted and we're going to straighten that out right now. It's often used to destroy another individual. I'm going to beat them down because I'm so angry with them. It is an expression of revenge, and the Bible says that God will take care of that. It's often used to break relationships and to hurt other people. We have that argument. We manifest that anger as we storm out the door. It's a violation of who we are and of the character God would want us to have. And we get angry at those individuals who cross us in some way or another. So anger for us is not a good thing. It's something we've got to learn to control. Now, in question 12, in the workbook again, the author asks, why is the man who rules his spirit better than a military hero? That's pretty much what Solomon is saying over in Proverbs chapter 16. He's making the point here that, yes, a military hero gets his attention, but somebody who can control his anger is also to be valued. In Proverbs 16 and verse 32, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. A warrior has to fight and do what goes with his job in that regard, as hopefully he is campaigning for a righteous cause and hoping that justice will prevail. But to the individual who's able to control his anger, he is sure and steadfast in all situations. And so we find here he is the one that's going to win that battle within. In Romans chapter 7, Paul talked about how we struggle within ourselves, knowing what is right and knowing what is wrong, but we have to deal with the temptations that come our way. And sometimes we feel like we are the victim of warfare. Over in Romans at chapter 7, beginning in verse 21, Paul says, I find then a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am. We do have a struggle to keep control. We have to grow stronger in that. Learn how to manage our anger, how to diffuse our anger, how to continue to behave ourselves in a godly way. So we can't turn ourselves over to the passions of war. We simply focus on doing that which is right. In question 13, what is the correct way to express anger? Well, we've got to work to keep it under control, to decompress, and to allow ourselves to achieve a calm once again. We want it to come to a positive end. We don't want to leave damage in our wake, whether it's physical damage or emotional damage, because we were temporarily out of control. We want to be able to manage and decompress that anger so that it quickly can pass away. And then finally, what character weaknesses does a man who shows no anger have? Now, there are some folks who don't seem to ever have an angry bone in their body, and they just kind of roll with all the punches. But the problem is they sometimes do not stand up when they need to. We can develop a very compromising, yielding nature where we will give over even to sin because we just want to avoid the conflict. And so rather than having the courage to stand up, even to face the conflict and to deal with the struggle, we're just, okay, anything you say, it's all going to be fine. We'll just do whatever you want. And often we can find ourselves pushed right along into a road of sinful behavior rather than saying, no, I'm not going to do certain things. That's sinful, it's wrong, and I will not participate. Well, they may come back at you about that with a lot of verbal or even physical abuse. But the Christian stands his ground. He's not going to be a compromiser and just give over to every sinful whim that comes past because he's too afraid, cowardly, and so compliant that he hasn't got the courage to stand up for that which is right. Well, this is the lesson that the author gave to us, dealing with the idea of anger and the importance of controlling it. And I hope we've seen some verses and thought about some illustrations that can help us to focus on the importance of anger management, being able to keep our anger under control, and to admonish other people to do the same as we strive to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord. And we appreciate you being with us for our class.